I've always had a soft spot for family. So when my sister called me one day asking if her son, Jake, could stay with me for a week while he attended a training program in my city, I didn't think twice. Of course, I said cheerfully, picturing the lanky, awkward teenager I'd last seen a few years ago. But when Jake arrived at my doorstep, I barely recognized him. He had grown into a confident, well-spoken young man with an easy smile that lit up the room. His voice carried a sense of maturity I hadn't expected, and for a moment, I felt a strange mix of pride and surprise. As we sat down for dinner that evening, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Jake shared stories about his college life, his career aspirations, and the challenges he had faced along the way. I listened, genuinely impressed by his ambition and the thoughtful way he spoke. There was an openness about him that felt disarming, and before I realized it, I was sharing my own stories about work, life, and the quiet loneliness that had crept into my routine. He seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and offering insights that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It was refreshing, even comforting, to have someone to talk to. The week began to unfold in a comfortable rhythm. Jake offered to help around the house, insisting on doing the dishes after meals and even fixing a creaky cabinet door I had been ignoring for months. We spent evenings watching movies, laughing over old family anecdotes, and playing card games that brought back memories of his childhood. But as the days passed, I started to notice subtle shifts in our interactions. It wasn't anything overt, just the way his gaze lingered a second too long when I laughed, or the way he seemed to choose words carefully when he complimented me. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, a product of too much time spent alone. Then there were the moments that felt harder to dismiss. Like the time he stood a little too close while helping me carry groceries into the kitchen, his hand accidentally brushing against mine. Or the way his voice softened when he thanked me for letting him stay, his eyes holding mine a beat longer than necessary. I tried to ignore the unease creeping into my thoughts, reminding myself that this was Jake, my nephew. Any perceived tension had to be in my head, a misunderstanding of innocent gestures. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken was beginning to unfold between us. One night, as we sat on the couch talking about his plans for the future, he paused mid-sentence, his expression turning serious. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I've always admired you. You're so strong, so inspiring." I laughed nervously, trying to deflect the weight of his words. But as he looked at me, I realized this week might not be as simple as I had thought. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The days that followed were filled with an unexpected sense of ease and connection. Jake had a way of making everything feel lighter, as though his presence somehow lifted the quiet solitude I had grown used to. Our conversations grew deeper, venturing into personal stories and confessions I hadn't shared with anyone in years. One evening, we sat at the dining table long after dinner, talking about dreams and regrets. He listened intently as I spoke about my career, the relationships that had ended before they truly began, and the doubts that sometimes kept me up at night. Jake's responses were thoughtful, and he spoke with an understanding beyond his years, as though he truly saw me, not just as an aunt, but as a person with layers and complexities. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, the way he made me feel valued in every interaction. His compliments became more frequent, but never felt forced. He'd say things like, "You have a way of making people feel at home," or "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." They were small remarks, yet they lingered in my mind long after the conversations ended. One night, as we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, a sudden rainstorm rolled in. We rushed inside, laughing at how drenched we'd become in just a few seconds. He handed me a towel, his hand brushing mine briefly. It was such a small gesture, but in that moment, the air between us seemed to change. I caught myself studying him when I thought he wasn't looking, his sharp features, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the confidence in his voice. It felt wrong, these thoughts creeping into my mind, but they came unbidden, refusing to be silenced. I told myself it was just the result of spending too much time together in close quarters, that these fleeting moments of attraction were a trick of my own loneliness. But it wasn't just me. There were moments when his gaze lingered, when his words carried a weight they hadn't before. He'd find reasons to stand closer, to offer subtle compliments that felt too personal to ignore. I wanted to convince myself it was innocent, but part of me knew it wasn't. On one of those quiet evenings, he hesitated before leaving the room, as though he wanted to say something but was holding back. When I asked if everything was all right, he gave me a small, almost shy smile and said, I feel really lucky to have you in my life. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, feeling a strange mix of flattery and unease. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to admit to myself. What was happening between us wasn't supposed to happen. Yet, with each passing day, the line between family and something else was blurring, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and about him. It all came to a head one evening, when the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over. The power had gone out during a heavy storm, leaving the house shrouded in darkness and silence except for the sound of rain hammering against the windows. Jake suggested lighting candles, and we sat in the dim glow, the atmosphere strangely intimate. Our conversation started innocently enough, talking about family memories and future plans, but there was a weight to his words that hadn't been there before. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine as he said, "You've been more than just an aunt to me this week. You've been a friend, someone I feel like I can really talk to." I smiled, trying to keep things light, but the way he looked at me made it impossible to ignore the shift between us. He hesitated, then added, "I've never felt this kind of connection with anyone before. I don't know how to explain it, but being here with you has felt different. Special." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. My heart raced as I tried to find the right response, but before I could, he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel." I froze, my mind racing with confusion, guilt, and a spark of something I didn't want to name. "Jake," I said finally, my voice trembling. "This isn't right. You're my nephew." "I know," he said, his tone filled with anguish. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. You're amazing, and I've never met anyone like you." His words were disarming, and for a fleeting moment, I found myself drawn to the intensity in his eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. But the reality of the situation came crashing down on me like a wave. I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. "This can't happen," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my inner conflict. Jake looked devastated but nodded. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make things awkward. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." The next morning, the atmosphere between us was strained. Jake avoided eye contact, and I found myself retreating into silence, unsure of how to navigate the situation. When it was time for him to leave, he stood at the door with his bags, looking conflicted. "I'm sorry for everything," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I hope I haven't ruined things between us." I forced a smile, though my heart felt like it was breaking. "We'll be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. As he walked out the door, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The connection we had shared was undeniable, but the consequences of letting it continue would have been far too great. In the quiet that followed his departure, I was left to face the emotional fallout, grappling with feelings of betrayal, guilt, and loss. In the days after Jake left, the house felt impossibly quiet. The silence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that couldn't be undone. I replayed our conversations, our moments of connection, and that one night when the boundaries we should have respected had been stretched too far. Guilt clung to me like a shadow, but so did something else, a sense of loss that I didn't fully understand. What Jake had said to me wasn't just about attraction. It was about seeing me in a way I hadn't been seen in years. He had made me feel alive, but the price of that feeling was too steep. I spent my time reflecting, digging into the reasons I had let things get as far as they had. It wasn't just about Jake. It was about the emptiness I'd been carrying long before he arrived. I realized that I'd been so starved for connection that I hadn't noticed how vulnerable it made me. Jake had stepped into that void, and in doing so, had awakened feelings I hadn't been prepared to confront. But reflection also brought clarity. This wasn't just about me, it was about him too. He was young, still figuring out his place in the world, and I had a responsibility to guide him, not let him blur lines that should have remained clear. I knew I had failed in some ways, but I also knew that acknowledging that failure was the first step toward moving on. A few months later, Jake reached out. His message was brief, but sincere. He apologized again for what had happened and thanked me for being someone he could look up to, even if things had gotten complicated. He admitted that he had been confused, that his feelings had been real but misguided. I responded carefully, choosing my words with the weight they deserved. I told him I forgave him, but I also made it clear that our relationship needed to change. I wanted him to know that I cared about him, but I couldn't allow myself to be pulled into something that was wrong for both of us. He understood, and while there was an undeniable awkwardness in our exchange, there was also a sense of closure. After that, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I joined a book club, started volunteering, and reconnected with old friends I had distanced myself from over the years. Slowly, I began to find pieces of myself that I had forgotten existed. Jake and I kept our distance for a while, but over time, we managed to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't the same as before, but it was healthier, grounded in the lessons we had both learned. Looking back, I realized that the experience, as painful as it was, had taught me something valuable. It reminded me of the importance of boundaries, the dangers of loneliness, and the strength it takes to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. Life doesn't always unfold the way you expect, but it's in those messy, complicated moments that you often find the clarity to move forward.